Dear students, now we are going to discuss about the lesson on disaster management. Disaster is a catastrophe caused due to internal and external factors which leads to large scale destruction to human built environment. Disasters are a result of misfortune but which goes unchecked over time, which outbreaks finally into massive loss known as disaster. Disaster can be controlled and reduced by taking conscious steps in that direction. Disaster management is an attempt to study the process of hazard turning to disaster and to identify the reasons to provide solutions through public policy decisions taken to permit habitation in disaster prone areas, permitting hazardous chemical factories to function in residential zones, land use policy of urban planners for permitting colonies to come up in the dried up waterbed, poor laws to cross check or mitigate the environmental damage, etc., which creates the conditions that leads to hazards turn into disaster. The disaster is simple related how much impact hazard has on environment and society. The scale of impact on which the disaster is related to the conditions of choices which they have adopted for their lives and for other environment. Whatever governments follow and formulate as a policy for food, water, finance, build and also teach in schools, then it is easy for us to mitigate or control the damage or loss by planning appropriately in making decisions on improving the socioeconomic conditions within the better controlled mechanisms. Each decision and action make us more vulnerable to disasters or more resilient to them. Henceforth, the answer is simple: more governments, agencies, organizations, business and civil society and public understand risk and vulnerability, the better choice they will take to mitigate disasters when they strike and save more lives. The widely accepted classification system used by the Disaster Information Management System of DISINVENTOR classifies disasters arising from natural hazards into 5 major categories. Geographical. Main event of geographical hazards are earthquakes, mass movement of earth materials, volcanoes, tsunamis. The actions caused by this event would lead to surface displacement of earthen materials, liquefaction, landslide, wildfires, ashfall, lahar, hot or cold mixture of earthen material flowing on the slope of volcano either during or between volcanic eruption, pyroclastic flow, extremely hot gases, ash and other materials of more than 1000 degrees Celsius that rapidly flowed down the flank of a volcano, a series of waves with long wavelengths when traveling across the deep ocean, and tsunamis that are generated by displacement of a massive amounts of water through underwater earthquakes, volcanic eruptions or landslides. Hydrological. Main events of hydrological hazards are floods, landslides and wave actions. The actions lead to avalanche of snow or debris, coastal floods or erosions, expensive soil, earthen material particularly clays that upon wetting, freezing or drying will alternately expand or contract, causing damage to foundations of building and other structures. Shrinkage is generally referred to as desiccation, flash floods, ice jam floods, the accumulation of floating ice restricting or blocking a river's flow and drainage, rogue waves, an unusual single crest of an ocean wave far out at sea that is much higher and are steeper than other waves in the prevailing swell system. Ski, a standing wave of water in a large semi or fully enclosed body of water lakes or bays created by strong winds or a large barometric pressure gradient. Sinkhole, collapse of the land surface due to the dissolving of the subsurface rocks such as limestone or carbonate rock by water. Meteorological. Main events of meteorological hazards include consecutive and extratropical storms, tropical cyclone, extreme temperatures and fog. The action leads to cold wave, frost or a freezing climate. Dericho, widespread and usually fast moving windstorms associated with the convective storm. Hailstorm, solid precipitation in the form of irregular pellets or balls of ice more than 5 mm in diameter. Torrential rains, lightning, sand, dust storm, snow, heat waves, storm surge, an abnormal rise in sea level generated by a tropical cyclone or other intense storms, winds and winter storm. Main events of climatological hazards include drought, an extended period of unusually low precipitation that produce a shortage of water for people, animals and plants. Drought is different from most other hazards in that way develops slowly, sometimes even over years, and its onset is generally difficult to detect. Drought is not solely a physical phenomenon because its impacts can be aggravated by human activities and water supply demands. Glacial lake outburst, a flood that occurs when a water dammed by a glacier or a moraine is suddenly released. Glacial lakes can be at the front of the glacier, marginal lake, or below the ice sheet, subglacial lake. Subsidence refers to the sinking of the ground due to groundwater removal, mining, dissolution of limestone, and wildfire actions lead to land fires and forest fires. Main events of biological hazards include the animal incident, human encounters with the dangers of exotic animals in both urban and rural environments, diseases and insect infection. This action leads to bacterial and unusual increase in the number of incidents caused by the exposure of bacteria either through skin contact, ingestion or inhalation. Fungal parasitic exposure to parasites occurs mostly through contaminated water, food or contact with insects. Viral and prion. Prion diseases are transmissible spongiform encephalitis are a family of rare progressive neurodegenerative disorders that affect both humans and animals diseases. Stages of disaster recognized in India. According to the High Powered Committee on Disaster Management of 2001, based on the vulnerability and risk involved in the disaster and the approach of the authorities in tackling the situation, the level of disaster have been categorized into 3 stages. L1, the level of disaster that can be managed within the capabilities and resources at the district level. L2, the disaster situations that require assistance and active mobilization of the resources at the state level. L3, a catastrophic situation or a very large scale disaster that is beyond the state and district authorities. Apart from L0, the period of normalcy, but nowhere these stages are mentioned in the DM Act of 2005. With this, the nation cannot announce any disaster as national calamity. Recent Kerala floods have been announced as an L3 stage, in which Member of Parliament can spend 1 crore rupees from its MP led funds. Over 700,000 people have lost their lives, over 1.4 million have been injured and approximately 23 million have been made homeless as a result of disasters. Overall, more than 1.5 billion people have been affected by disasters in various ways, with women, children and people in vulnerable situations disproportionately affected. The total economic loss was more than $1.3 trillion. Since 1980, 1.6 billion people have been killed in disasters, and the global average annual loss is estimated to increase up to $415 billion by 2030. In the context of human vulnerability to disasters, the economically and socially weaker segments of the population are the ones that are most seriously affected. Earthquakes in India. India being a prime victim of earthquakes from so many decades. In 1993, Latur and some parts of Maharashtra earthquake was one of the major earthquake in India. It resulted into 7,000 people died and 30,000 injured. 2001 Gujarat earthquake was the biggest earthquake in Indian disasters. Most parts of the Gujarat, including the Rapar, Bhuj, Anjar, Ahmedabad, Surat and Bhavnagar, in which 13,000 people are died and 6 million people were severely affected. This particular dreadful disaster shook the whole Gujarat. Later in 2011 earthquake in Sikkim and most of the northeastern states result in mass casualties. 100 people died, plenty of people were severely injured. Floods in India. India's vulnerability is very high when it comes to disasters like floods and landslides. As per the NDMA, that is National Disaster Management Authority's official data statistics, July 2005 Maharashtra floods were the biggest tragedy in which 1100 people were died, 167 injured and around 50 people went missing. These particular floods considered to be the deadliest natural disaster so far, 2009. Andhra Pradesh Krishna floods, 300 people died and many badly injured. 2012-13 Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh floods and landslides in Uttarakasi, Rudraprayag and Bageshwar hit with floods, landslides. Nearly more than 5,000 people were died and many injured and went missing. This particular natural disaster was an alarm for the Indian disaster response mechanism to fight and face against such big disasters in future. 2013 Andhra Pradesh floods resulted more than 50 fatalities and plenty went missing. In September 2014, Andhra Pradesh and Odisha witnessed a cyclone called Hudhud, in which many people were died. Latest one being the Kerala floods 2018, highest recorded precipitation in century, which has affected entire state and some parts of Karnataka bordering districts. Initial estimation of human loss is calculated around 445 people and 2 million flood victims. Kerala's transport system has been seriously impacted with about 11,000 kilometers of roads, 237 bridges are damaged, over 10,000 hectares are flood damaged at a cost of 5,720 billion rupees, that is $82 million in the hardest hit Idukki district itself. Initial estimates of the cost of the Kerala disaster currently stand at 200 billion rupees, that is $3 billion, but officials have warned that the final amount will be more than twice that figure. Out of 4 crore Kerala population, 53 lakh population is directly affected. Decision-making bodies and institutions at national level. Cabinet Committee on Security, that is why called CCS, is the apex political decision-making body on disaster management, which comprises of Prime Minister and his core team of Home, Finance, Defence and External Affairs Ministers. Vital role of this body includes reviewing, evaluation and overseeing the risk of CBRN emergencies and disasters with security implications. National Crisis Management Committee, NCMC, is the highest administrative decision-making body, consists of Cabinet Secretary as its chairman and other secretaries of departments and other institutions connected to national disaster. Vital role is to oversee the command, control and coordination of the disaster response, to give the directions to the crisis management group and specific actions to face crisis situations. National Disaster Management Authority, NDMA, is the establishment of Government of India in 2005 by an Act of DM 2005, chaired by the Prime Minister with the 9 members appointed by him. Major task of the authority is related to the laying down and approving the policies, plans, guidelines for the disaster management, which need to be followed by the different central ministries, departments and the state governments, coordinate their application and implementation throughout the country. It also takes such other measures as it may consider necessary for the prevention of disasters or mitigation or preparedness and capacity building for dealing with the threatening disaster situation or disaster. It will oversee and authorize the authorities or department concerned to procure the material necessary for the relief. NDMA is authorized to handle all types of natural and man-made disasters. Natural Disaster Management Institute and National Disaster Response Force works within the guidelines and directives set by NDMA. National Executive Committee (NEC) is the executing agency at the national level, consists of Home Secretary as its chairman and Agriculture, Atomic Energy, Defence, Drinking Water and Sanitation, Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Finance, Expenditure, Health and Family Welfare, Power, Rural Development, Science and Technology, Space, Telecommunications, Urban Development, Water Resources, River Development and Ganga Rejuvenation, the Chief of the Integrated Defence Staff, the Chiefs of Staff Committee as its members. Important role of NEC is to assist NDMA in discharging its functions, coordinating and monitoring the implementation of National Disaster Management Plan. Monitor the departmental disaster management plans. It can direct to departments to deploy any men or procure any material and resources for the purpose of response and relief activities conducted by NDMA or SDMA. Direct and coordinate with the agencies, departments and state governments with regard to the measures taken in response to the event of any threatening disaster situation. It coordinates with the armed forces, the National Disaster Response Force (NDRF), civil defence volunteers, home guards and fire services, Indian Meteorological Department and specialized scientific institutions to aid the state authorities at the time of disaster. National Disaster Response Force are the specially trained force headed by a Director General structured for rapid deployment. In return, they assist the state government or district authorities at the time of disaster or for the rebuilding of the disaster stricken area. They are under the general supervision and mandated under the guidelines of NDMA. They are trained and equipped in the handling the serious threatening disaster situations. The NDRF unit will train the stakeholder in the respective locations identified by the state government. National Institute for Disaster Management is constituted by an Act of Parliament under the provision of DM Act 2005 to cater the capacity developmental activities of disaster management in India and the region, and consists of Union Home Minister, Vice Chairman NDMA, members including secretaries of various nodal ministries and departments of Government of India and state governments and heads of national level scientific research and technical organization, besides eminent scholars, scientists and practitioners. NIDM has been assigned the responsibility for the development of human resource, capacity building, training, research, documentation, create awareness and assist in policy formulation in the field of disaster management within the broader policies and guidelines laid by NDMA. It provides technical support to the state governments through the disaster management centers in the administrative training institutes of the states and union territories. Institutions at state level. As per the DM Act of 2005, mandates each state to set up its own institutional framework for disaster management, that is called State Disaster Management Authority (SDMA) under the chairmanship of the Chief Minister. The Act mandates that each state shall take necessary steps for integrating measures for prevention of disasters or mitigation as part of their state disaster management plans, allocation of funds for DM and establish early warning systems. Depending on specific situations, states should be competent enough to support and assist NDMA whenever called upon. Similar system is established at Union Territory with a Lieutenant Governor as the chairperson. At the district level, the district collector or district magistrate or the deputy commissioner heads the district disaster management authority DDMA with elected representatives as co-chairman. Those institutions will be responsible for overall coordination of the disaster management efforts and planning. Detailed disaster management plan will be developed subject to periodic review and revision at the levels of state, district, towns and blocks. Disaster management cycle. Disaster management purposes is to minimize or mitigate the possible damages from hazards, provide and equip and suitable assistance to victims of disaster and achieve quick and effective recovery. The disaster management cycle explains the flow in which governments, non-governmental and private establishments formulate roadmap to decrease or avoid the impact of disaster, react during and immediately following a disaster, and take constructive and effective measures to recover in shortest possible time after a disaster. Possible actions at all stages in the cycle lead to well prepared establishment in early warnings, reduced vulnerability or the prevention of disasters during the next repetition of the cycle. The complete disaster management cycle includes the shaping of public policies and plans that either modify the causes of disasters or mitigate their effects of people, property and infrastructure. The mitigation and the preparedness phases occur as disaster management improvements are made in advance of a disaster event. Developmental considerations play a key role in contributing to the mitigation and preparedness of a community to effectively confront a disaster. As a disaster occurs, disaster management actors become involved in the immediate response and long-term recovery phases with the help of humanitarian responders. The 4 disaster management phases illustrated here do not always or even generally occur in isolation or in this precise order. Often phases of the cycle overlap and the length of each phase greatly depends on the severity of the disaster. Mitigation: minimizing or mitigating the outcome of the disaster. Examples: building codes and early warning systems, vulnerability analysis, public education, appropriate and adequate policies. Preparedness: equipped planning to respond to disaster. Examples: preparedness plans, emergency exercises, capacity building, warning systems. Response: effort to minimize the catastrophe created by disaster. Examples: search and rescue, emergency relief. Recovery: building the disaster stricken area to normalcy. Examples: temporary housing, grants, medical care. Understanding risk: thematic area of action focus on the Sendai framework priority in understanding risk, which focus on observation and forecasting. Mapping, zoning, monitoring and warning, assessing the vulnerability and disseminating the information, having adequate machinery for gathering information and disseminating the information, the major part in risk reduction and improving the resilience. Interagency coordination framework focuses on strengthening the disaster risk governance, overall disaster governance, response, providing warnings, information and data and non-structural measures. It is a top level overall intra-agency coordination who are assigned with the risk reduction governance. Basically, the activity of central government agencies holding the hazard specific responsibilities are expected to play a major role. Non-structural measure comprising of laws, norms, rules, guidelines and techno-legal regime, that is the building codes, National Disaster Management Plan, Government of India quotes all these. Investing in structural measures for disaster risk reduction. One of the major thematic are for risk reduction and enhance resilience is by improving physical infrastructure and the facilities required to the communities to cope from disaster. This improves disaster preparedness and investigating in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Invest in non-structural measures for disaster risk reduction, formation of technical and legal laws, mechanisms to fulfill the requirement for risk reduction and enhancing resilience. The component fall under the priority 2 of the Sendai framework in strengthening the disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. The central and state governments will have to set up necessary institutional support for enforcement, monitoring and compliance, capacity building and development. The capacity development includes training programs, curriculum development, large scale awareness creation efforts and carrying out regular mock drills and disaster response exercises. The capability to implement, enforce and monitor various disaster mitigation measures has to be improved at all levels, from the local to the higher levels of governance. It is also strengthening the disaster risk reduction governance at all levels to better manage risk and to make the governance systems more responsive. As per the NDMA, major tasks of response given in the responsibility matrix are early warning, maps, satellite inputs, information dissemination, evacuation of people and animals, search and rescue of people and animals, medical care, drinking water, dewatering pumps, sanitation facilities, public health, food and essential supplies, communication, housing and temporary shelters, power, fuel, transportation, relief logistics and supply chain management, disposal of animal carcasses, fodder for livestock in scarcity hit areas, rehabilitation and ensuring safety of livestock and other animals, veterinary care, data collection and management, relief employment, media relations. In recent times, now in India, there has been a paradigm shift in mitigating and proactively preventing the disasters. Magnitude of the disasters post 2004 tsunami to latest Kerala episode is a lesson to what extent we should be prepared to mitigate or strengthen the pre and post procedural activities by amending, enacting legislatures for safety from hazards. Regular mock exercise or drills will keep the risk reduction personnel active in tackling any kind of situation and hazard will throw to humankind. Mandatory awareness programs to be incorporated to all organizations, communities, institutions, particularly focusing on vulnerable sections. Legislations with regard to periodical inspections of public and private establishments such as vulnerable buildings, schools, hospitals, apartments, water tanks, nuclear facilities and industries etc., incorporating laws and bylaws for the safety of precautions to be taken at the time of building new establishments and dosing or re-strengthening, rebuilding vulnerable buildings. States are supposed to strengthen the district units with regular coordination with fixed allocation of reserve funds. All measures combined can make a safer and secure place for humankind to establish and grow. Understanding disaster risk not make us sensitive to the hazard, our exposure and vulnerability, but also build society's capacity to protect itself from disasters. The ability of communities, societies and institutions to resist, absorb, accommodate, recover from disasters, whilst at the same time improve well-being of humankind will be the eventual disaster management.